The neighborly silence hides secrets. A son falls in love with a girl, but his father is against it. The ban has deeper reasons that are gradually revealed. Deep in Kentucky, among old forests and cornfields, stood the Clark family home. The house was simple wooden, with a weathered porch and a swing that had long since creaked as if it wanted to tell something. Across the road, a little further down the slope, lived the Mortons. The distance between the houses was small, but the silence between these two families was louder than any words. Once upon a time, before the Clarks had a son, something serious had happened. No one mentioned it directly, but everyone in the county knew there was an old grudge between the Clarks and the Mortons. Whether it was over land, or over money, or something family related, no one could say for sure. But the adults didn't greet each other, didn't look in the direction of the neighbor's house. And the children, when they were little, already felt it. Well, Harold Clark, the head of the family, was strict. He worked hard, kept everything to himself, and didn't like it when things didn't go according to plan. His wife, Mary, was a quiet woman. She cooked soup, did the laundry, and was more silent than she spoke. Their son, Jacob, was their only child. They had been waiting for him for a long time, and when he was born, Harold decided that he would make him the right man. Strong, smart, and someone who wouldn't get involved with anyone he didn't want. Jacob grew up like all children. He played by the river, rode his bike, and helped his father with firewood. But as the years went by, he became different. He thought more, talked less. And he often looked toward that house across the road. And even more often, at Lily. Lily Morton was Jacob's age. Slender, with blonde hair and a kind of calm look. She often sat on the porch, a book in her hands. Sometimes Jacob would stop when he rode by on his bike. They didn't talk, but that was enough. Then they started meeting in the woods, where no one could see. They would just sit, sometimes they would write on the bark of trees. They would laugh. They would look up at the sky. There was something between them that didn't need words. Harold began to notice the changes. Jacob was different. There was a calmness that his father didn't understand. Harold didn't ask directly, but he didn't have to. He understood everything. And inside him, a growing feeling grew that everything was going wrong. His son had gotten involved with a girl from that house, from that family. And it was like a knife in his back. Mary could feel the tension. She didn't say anything, but her hands had become slower, and her gaze more anxious. There was less laughter in the house. Harold would sit in the workshop more often, planing something, but never finishing it. Jacob would come in late, without explaining anything. And one day he didn't come at all. 3 days passed. The rain fell almost non-stop. Drops ran down the windows, and the clock in the kitchen ticked every minute so loudly that it seemed to scream. Mary got up at 6, as usual. She made coffee, made breakfast for 3, but no one sat down at the table. Harold would go out into the yard silently, never taking off his hat, even in the rain. He would just stand there, staring at the wet field, as if searching for something. Then he would come back, change his clothes, and go to the barn. He never asked, he never spoke. But he would look at her accusingly. Jacob wasn't there. The phone was in the room. His backpack was on the floor by the bed. His sneakers weren't tied. His jacket was in the closet. Mary had been going through things at night, quietly so that her husband wouldn't hear. She touched each sleeve as if trying to find an answer in the fabric. But there was no answer. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the house. Lily was standing on the porch in a light jacket. She was soaked, but she wasn't paying attention. Mary opened the door and looked at her for a long time. The girl didn't say anything, she just stood there. Harold came over and stood next to her. And he looked too. All three of them were silent. Then Mary nodded. Lily left. Also silent. From that day on, Harold became even more withdrawn. He stopped working with wood. He stopped going out into the fields. He even stopped walking the dog, the same old bitch that Jacob had brought home when she was a puppy. Mary saw the man sitting in the dark in the kitchen at night. His cup was full, his hands were empty. His eyes were fixed on the wall. The locals started asking questions. Some said they had seen Jacob at the bus station. Some said he had spent the night in an old barn by the church. An old man from the store said he had seen him get into someone else's car and drive off towards Memphis. Harold didn't believe anyone. Mary just listened and nodded. One morning Harold did go to the Morton house. Without a word, without warning. He just crossed the field and stood by the fence. Lily's father came out to meet him. They stood in silence for about 5 minutes. Then Harold turned and walked back. From that day on, the silence between them grew louder. Time passed. Autumn passed by the houses like a stranger. The leaves had fallen quickly. The trees were bare, and the wind was moving across the field as if searching for something. Everything in the Clark house had become even quieter. Mary no longer cooked dinners for 3. She simply cooked for herself and Harold, sometimes even without meat. They ate in silence. Their eyes rarely met. But each knew very well what the other was thinking. The people in the town had stopped asking. Everyone understood everything. Jacob had disappeared. No one knew where. And no one knew if he would come back. Harold acted as if his son had never been there. He didn't remember, he didn't speak. But every evening he would go out onto the porch and stand there for a few minutes. He drank from a flask. Smoked. He looked out towards the field, at the same tree under which Jacob had once sat. With Lily. Lily began to appear less often. At first she sat on the porch every day, sometimes even in the rain. Then once every few days. After her father Harold came to her house, she seemed to understand something. She started wearing different clothes to school, stopped painting her nails. And then she disappeared for a week. Some said she was lying at home with a fever. Some said she had gone to another city. But only she and her parents knew the truth. Mary had seen Lily stop in front of their house one day. She just stood on the curb, looked. Then she took something out of her pocket, a small piece of paper, as thin as dry leaves. She folded it in half, left it on the Clark's old mailbox, and left. Harold never read this letter. He took it silently, put it in a drawer by his bed, and never touched it again. The winter was cold. The house creaked at night, the winds beat against the windows. Jacob's old dog didn't want to eat. He lay by the door and looked where no one came from. Harold covered him with his jacket one evening. He returned to the kitchen himself, and for the first time in a long time he said something to Mary. She didn't answer. She just put a plate in front of him. In February a letter arrived from Memphis. The envelope briefly said that the boy was alive. That he was working. That he asked not to look for him. Harold burned the letter in the oven. Mary stood nearby. She said nothing. She just watched the flames eat away at the paper. Then she went into the room and closed the windows. Spring came quietly. The trees turned green again, but nothing had changed in the Clark house. People began to forget. Life went on. Someone was building a barn, someone was getting married, someone was arguing again over the boundary. Everything went on as usual. Until the day a car appeared in the yard. Old, a little rusty, with someone else's license plates. A young man got out. Grown, tanned, in a denim shirt. No bags, nothing. He stood by the porch, for a long time not daring to look up. Mary came out first. She stood for several minutes, not moving. Then she came closer and hugged him. Quietly, tightly, without a word. Harold came out later. He saw his son and stopped. He did not come closer. He just stared. His eyes were dry, but heavy. Then he turned and went to the barn. That evening no one had dinner. Everyone sat in different rooms. It was quiet, only the old dog got up and lay down at Jacob's feet. For the first time in many months, Jacob stayed. He didn't explain why he had returned. He didn't say much. He slept in his room, but he didn't open the windows. He kept to himself all the time, as if he were still not home. Mary left food on the table for him, washed his clothes, but there was no joy in his voice. She knew something was wrong. He exuded silence. The same silence that Harold had once exuded. Only different in meaning. Harold didn't ask anything. He didn't press, but he didn't come closer either. He simply accepted the fact that his son was under the same roof. Nothing more, nothing less. The tacit agreement that held this whole family together. A week passed. Jacob began to go outside. He often went into the field, sat under the same tree. He sat for hours, not moving. Sometimes he held something in his hand, a piece of paper or a letter. Mary saw it from afar, but didn't dare approach. She was afraid of destroying something. This fragile piece that hung by a thread. One evening Jacob disappeared again. He didn't return until evening. He didn't answer the calls. But this time Mary didn't panic. She knew something. Intuitively. She just sat by the window and waited. And when in the darkness she saw her son walking down the road. Slowly but surely, she didn't ask anything. He had been to that house. Morton's. It was clear from the expression on his face, in his eyes. Something had happened there. Maybe a conversation. Maybe an answer. Or maybe a farewell. He didn't say anything, and Mary didn't ask. The next day a letter arrived. An old one, a little yellowed. Harold received it himself. He read it. His face remained impassive, only the corner of his eye twitched slightly. He went to the barn, made a lot of noise there, threw something, broke something. When he came out, he was holding a box in his hands, an old, dusty one. He put it in his son's room. And he left. Jacob opened the box only at night. There were photographs in it. Old ones, from Harold's youth. A woman with soft features, in a summer dress, stood next to a man who did not look like his father. There was something strange about these photographs, as if they were not from their lives. Extraneous. Incomprehensible. But Jacob saw a familiar face. A young man. Standing next to the woman. And it was the face of Lily's father. Then Jacob began to understand. There was more than just a misunderstanding between Harold and the Morton family. It was a story. A long, painful one. Maybe they had once been friends. Maybe more than friends. Maybe Harold and Lily's mother knew each other better. than they should have. Or maybe it had all been ruined by one wrong move. One betrayed choice. It wasn't just a fight. It was something deeper. Something that wasn't said out loud. Now Jacob understood why his father had been so stubbornly silent. Why he was against it. Why he hadn't looked him in the eye. Because he saw himself in Lily. He saw repetition in their meetings. Or maybe revenge. Spring had fully come into its own. The field was blooming. The trees were rustling again. The people of the town were even beginning to forget that anything had ever happened. But not in the Clark family. They had to live with it. And although Jacob stayed home, his thoughts were constantly elsewhere. He often sat in the barn, going through old things, sometimes burning something on wood, sometimes writing some fragments on the back of old checks, perhaps memories. Mary knew that her son would not stay here for long. She saw him silently preparing himself for a new journey. One morning he packed his things again. Calmly, without emotion. Harold came out to meet him. This time he looked his son in the eyes. Long. Then he nodded. And went into the house. This time Jacob did not go away. He moved to a neighboring town, where he began working in an auto repair shop. He rented a small apartment. Sometimes he came for the weekends. He sat on the porch, talked to his mother, helped with the house. He did not speak to his father anymore. But the silence was different. There was no anger in it. Only acceptance. A few months later, Harold became ill. Nothing serious, but something inside him snapped. He often sat on the bed, holding the same box of photos. Sometimes he opened it. Sometimes he just held it. One evening, when the sky was full of stars, Harold did speak to Mary. Quietly, briefly. He said that he had once had a choice. That he had chosen the wrong one. That he had ruined not only his own life, but also the lives of others. And that his greatest fear was to see his son go the same way. Mary simply put her hand on his shoulder. And they sat like that until dawn. Summer in these parts came suddenly. One day there was still fog and rain, and the next there was heat, dry earth, and the smell of dust in the air. The fields were green, the grass was waist-high, and the old barn was crackling again in the scorching rays. But inside the house, nothing had changed. Silence still sat in every corner, like an uninvited guest. Jacob rarely came. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. What to say. What to do. His apartment in the town was modest, without anything superfluous. A bed, a table, a chair by the window. There he read old books that someone had left in the garage. Sometimes diaries that he found at flea markets. He liked to read other people's thoughts, especially those that no one ever intended to make public. There was something familiar in each of them, a silence that could not be spoken aloud. Mary, meanwhile, lived her daily life. The garden, the chickens, the house. It was as if she deliberately didn't allow herself to stop. Movement was a way of not feeling. But at night she would get up. She would sit in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, look out the window. Sometimes she would think of the days when Jacob was a child. How they had laughed. How Harold had played ball with him back then. How things could have been different. Harold was aging quickly. The loss of strength was not physical, it came from within. He no longer cared even for the things that were the meaning of everything, the wood, the tools, the work. He would just sit on the porch for hours. Not watching, not listening. Just being. Present, but distant. One day Jacob came and brought a box. Inside were books, notebooks, a few old photographs. He put it on the kitchen table and told Mary that it was for her. That it was the stories of people who were no longer there. She looked through them in the evenings, carefully, as if she were touching other people's lives with her fingers. And in each story she looked for something of her own. A few weeks later, someone new appeared in the town. A woman with a child moved into a house across the street. People immediately started talking who she was, or she was from, why she was alone. But Jacob knew that it was none of his business. He simply noticed her gaze somehow. Pure, but tired. There was no regret in it, no questions. Only life. And at that moment he realized that not all stories had to be a repetition of the old ones. And a week later he happened to see Lily at a bus stop in another city. She was standing with a bag, looking in the direction of the road. She had grown old, lost weight, but her eyes were the same. She noticed him. But she didn't come up to him. And he did too. It was a silent agreement. Everything that needed to be said had long since been said, not in words, but in the silence between them. After that, he went to his father's. He didn't tell him. He just showed up. He sat down next to him, on an old wooden chair. They were silent for an hour. And then Harold got up, went to the pantry, took out an old drawer that had been on the shelf for years. He put it on the table. There was an old notebook. Notes. Drawings. Thoughts. All of them from his youth. There was everything that Harold had never said. And there, between the pages, was a torn photograph. Harold, young, with that woman. With Lily's mother. But not in a quarrel, not in enmity. But in a silence that no one had yet broken. Jacob held this notebook in his hands for a long time. He didn't open it. He just felt its weight. And then he got up and said he would be back next week. At that time, Mary found letters in the old closet. Her own. She had once written to Jacob's mother when they were still engaged. And then to Harold's sister, who had gone north. There was another life in those letters. And Mary realized that she had also been silent for years. That she had also hidden stories. That they were all not only victims of silence, but also creators of it. Several more weeks passed. Harold hardly got out of bed. The doctor said that everything was slowly fading away. Nothing critical, just time. And Mary stopped crying. She understood that everything has a beginning and an end. But sometimes, even an end is a chance to start something over. One evening, when the sky was full of summer lightning, Jacob sat by his father's bed. He took his hand for the first time. He said nothing. But that was enough. Harold looked into his son's eyes, and for a moment something seemed to pass between them. Not forgiveness, but understanding. The next morning Jacob stayed another day. He helped his mother in the garden. Then he sat under a tree, the same one. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. Phrases from those old diaries were spinning in my head. Someone else's life, which became a mirror of my own. That summer he stayed longer. He started fixing the shed. He opened his father's old workshop. He brought new tools. The locals started coming in with little things that needed fixing, with things that needed fixing. And he fixed them. Without words. Without promises. Because sometimes, the strongest response is action. And he fixed them. Without words. Without promises. Because sometimes, the strongest response is action. Every day the house changed. Not on the outside, no. Still the same walls, the same wood. The slightly cracked paint. But inside there was a sense of a different air. A lighter one. Mary opened the windows more often. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread. Harold slept more than usual, but every morning he asked to be taken out onto the porch. He sat there and just listened to the sounds, the hammer in the workshop, the birds chirping, the wind swaying. The old cherry trees. One day Jacob took out an old camera. The same one that had been lying on the nightstand. For years. The film, the winding of the mechanism, the click of the shutter, he was doing all this for the first time, but carefully, slowly. He photographed things that others did not. Notice the peeling paint on the windowsill, the torn curtain, the old key hanging without a lock. He did not know why, but he felt that these things had a memory. In the evening, Mary found him in the basement. He was sitting among the boxes, sorting through things that should have been thrown away long ago. But he took each one out. Shook off the dust, examined it. The bundles of letters, the yellowed receipts, the old maps. With pencil marks, it was as if they were all part of a story he was just beginning to read. The next day he took Harold to an old lake. The one outside the city. They didn't speak. They just sat, looking at the water. And Jacob suddenly realized sometimes life requires nothing more than presence. His father didn't say anything special. But he didn't need to. Because the very fact that he had allowed his son to take him there was already a gesture of trust. When he returned, Jacob opened his father's diary for the first time. It contained fragments. Parts of the story, but not the whole thing. Not dates, not events. Just thoughts. Like a stream of consciousness. One passage stuck. I watched her hold the cup and thought, why did this hand, this movement, make me stay? And then everything disappeared. Everything except the silence. I gave up. From myself. From her. From who I could be. And another. My son should never have seen what I hid. But how can I hide what echoes in his eyes? Those phrases had no specifics. But they had pain. And he was the one who made them real. Jacob began to write. Not for anyone. Just in a notebook. His fragments. His sentences. He didn't try to explain. He simply left on paper what didn't fit in the silence. These weren't memories, more like fixations. The imprints of internal changes. Meanwhile, the neighbor girl from that new house began running across the street. Laughing, spinning a hoop, throwing a ball. She often approached Mary, helped in the garden, asked about the flowers. And Mary answered. And sometimes she just looked at her, as if she recognized something very far away. Something lost. One day, that girl left a drawing on the porch. In colored pencils. There was a house, a tree. 3 figures, a man, a woman, and someone younger. And the caption, "This is you." Mary held the drawing in her hands for a long time. And then she put it on the refrigerator. And a week later, Harold asked to flip through the old family albums. Jacob helped him. Page after page. Silently. Sometimes Harold would touch the faces in the photos with his finger. Sometimes he would just stare at one point, as if remembering something. Mary stood to the side. She didn't ask who he was looking for. She knew there was no answer in this album. But there were clues. A few more weeks passed like that. Jacob began to stay the night more often. Sometimes. At night, he would go outside, sit on the porch, and listen. Even in the silence there was a rhythm. April night. Mother's breathing. Father's snoring was barely audible. Somewhere in the field, an owl. This was his music. And then he realized, stories don't end. They simply pass from hand to hand. His grandfather was silent, his father was too. And now he was too. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a shadow. It had become a space. A possibility. And it was in it that something new was now being born. Jacob decided to stay. Not forever. But for longer. He made a table in the workshop, set up an old computer, scanned all the photos. He wanted to preserve them not as memories, but as a story. Not the one that is written in books, but the one that lives inside, like a quiet song. And every time he entered his father's room, he would not look away. They looked at each other longer. Deeper. As if each time they understood more and more. That silence is not always a loss. Sometimes it is a chance to say what cannot be conveyed in words. The days gradually merged into one whole. There was no longer a clear division between weekdays and weekends, between work and rest. Every morning began the same way, the smell of coffee, the faint creak of the wooden floor, a slight noise from the garden. Mary got up early, turned on the old radio, sometimes cooked breakfast, sometimes just stood by the window. Jacob learned not to disturb her silence. After lunch, he usually went to the barn. The workshop was not yet completely restored, but it was already alive. Order had appeared, tools in their places, shelves with small items laid out, a clean table surface. From time to time, one of the neighbors brought something to fix. An old frame, a door hinge, a wobbly chair. And although Jacob did not say much, people stayed longer than necessary. Just to sit next to him, drink water, catch their breath. Father no longer went outside. He lay down most of the time. Sometimes he asked for a newspaper, but he no longer read it, he just looked through it. In the evenings, Mary read aloud to him an old book, the same one they had bought together at the fair. It was a story about another place, another time. But each sentence had something of its own, something that touched them, even if it wasn't said directly. Jacob stayed in his father's room longer and longer. He didn't ask. He didn't force him to talk. He was just there. And Harold, though silently, seemed to let him be there. This silent presence gradually changed them both. Mary once showed Jacob an old box from the attic. It contained things from her youth, postcards, embroidered napkins, old bookmarks. Among them was a photo from the fair. She, Harold, and another couple. Jacob recognized the face. They were Lily's parents. Mary looked at the photo for a long time. Then she simply said, "Things could have been different." And she added nothing more. After that incident, Jacob began to collect stories. Not other people's, as he had done before, but his own.